Okay, so basically, just to get back to the point, this is a very important issue. This is a very topical issue. Today is the day of of the International Day Against Modern Slavery, and this is something that affects millions of people worldwide, and basically tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people here in the UK. This is something that is pretty unconnected to day-to-day life of people. Most people, I would say, probably, have a very skewed idea of what human trafficking means. They probably think it is connected with migration, and human trafficking can happen during migration, but it can happen also entirely domestically, entirely inside of any specific country. So a lot of people are, we're going to cover a few of the evidence of the data on this. A lot of people are being trafficked here in the UK, and they are UK nationals, so they're being trafficked, within the same country. And modern slavery can be a little bit of a confusing term to think about because, after all, what is modern slavery? We are used to see the term slavery, basically, being used of thinking about old-time slavery with people literally in chains and so on. Modern slavery is something a little bit different, and difficult actually to tackle. But basically, this is what we're going to cover in these 25 minutes that we have left, more or less. I'm going to cover what is human trafficking, so basically giving you a definition of what human trafficking means, and especially how it is different from just migration or smuggling of people and so on. I'm going to touch on the recruitment process, especially the ways in which people are recruited into being trafficked. I know it sounds a little bit weird, but that's how it happens. I'll cover a little bit the different types of exploitation, and especially the most important ones, and we'll see that sexual exploitation, for example, has a pretty important impact and a pretty important role in all this. Clarify the link between human trafficking and modern slavery, and then cover in the last few slides human trafficking and modern slavery in the UK with the data that we have available about numbers of people being referred for that, but also the last trends regarding, for example, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, human trafficking most commonly is connected to migration. And it is true that some people are that end up being trafficked are migrants. So especially, I would say, people think about large migration flows, those that bring people from Central America, from South America to North America, especially to the US, or from Sub-Saharan Africa all the way to Western Europe, including the UK. But when we see the legal definition of human trafficking, that's just part of the picture. And it is very, very important to understand that it is part of the picture, because otherwise we may end up cracking down just on one type of human trafficking, but not on others. And that's really important, of course. Also, human trafficking and modern slavery are linked. We will see that modern slavery is the endpoint of human trafficking. And that's a really, really important issue. So the two things must be understood together. There is no human trafficking without modern slavery at the end. Now, I won't go into a lot of details regarding the international law on this, but basically what happens is that we have protocol, basically coordinated by the United Nations that tries to, as you can see here, prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. And you can see here, especially women and children. Now, this is pretty interesting because, of course, you can imagine the focus of trafficking, like cracking down on trafficking in children, because, of course, children are, very vulnerable. There's a lot of potential for traumatic events to happen. Actually, basically the certainty of trauma happening as a consequence of trafficking. But the focus on women is because the whole movement against human trafficking was due to a lot of attention back then. You can see that the protocol was signed in 2000 and it was effective from 2003. There was a lot of attention back then regarding sexual trafficking. So basically trafficking for sexual exploitation purposes. But we can see that actually everyone can be a victim of trafficking. And, depending on, for example, the age and gender, the types of exploitation are different, but everyone, men, women, and so on, can be a victim of human trafficking. But basically, this protocol defines trafficking in persons with this very long definition that I will not go, through. But I have highlighted, so all these emphasis is added by me. I have highlighted a few important concepts. So the protocol says that trafficking in persons shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. So notice here, there's all the different stages of human trafficking that you can find. It's about recruiting, so the entrance into human trafficking, transporting, transferring, harboring, receipt. So you see that's all basically process by means of the threat of use of force or other force of coercion, of abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, and so on, or even giving or receiving payments or benefits. So basically, the idea is that these are all the means that are used to conduct human trafficking. And you can see a threat or use of force is the first one, but then fraud and deception and abuse of power are pretty prominent. And this is very important. And then for the purpose of exploitation. So you see, this is the difference between trafficking persons and smuggling people. Smuggling people is just the fact of bringing people across borders. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those people are going to be exploited when they arrive. Instead, trafficking is for the purpose of exploitation. And here you see like a list of types of exploitation. You can see prostitution, sexual exploitation in general, forced labor, slavery, practices similar to slavery, servitude, the removal of organs, although removal of organs is very, appealing to some people, there's like a morbid attention towards these cases, but actually it's a very tiny kind of event. It happens very rarely. That's what I'm saying. But of course, it makes sense to include it. So you see here, the purpose of exploitation is necessary to have human trafficking, and there's different ways in which exploitation can take place. Now, for most people, the line between trafficking and smuggling can be difficult to set, but exploitation is essential to actually do that, because otherwise we treat victims of trafficking as smuggled migrants. So people who consented fully to be smuggled in, people who have arrived illegally, and that should just be deported. If we treat victims of trafficking as smuggled migrants, then we ignore the exploitation they suffer. And that may even allow sometimes the exploitation to continue to take place. So this is very, very important that we make sure to keep this in mind. Victims of trafficking, differently from smuggled migrants, victims of trafficking continue to be exploited way after they arrive at the final destination, at the final endpoint. And that's the exploitation that actually makes the money, not the smuggling. So this is the difference between the two. Just as a recap of other types of differences between trafficking and smuggling. The first one, as I said, exploitation. Trafficking carries out exploitation even after the victims have arrived. Smuggling may exploit people by asking for a lot of money to be smuggled between borders, but once the migrants get on the other side of the border, that's it. When there is exploitation, it's trafficking. Consent is also important. Victims of trafficking did not give their consent. They were forced, they were coerced, or they gave consent that is null, that is not valid because of, it was given on the basis of false information. So basically, the idea is, if you're deceived, if you're scammed into consenting to trafficking, your consent is void, does not count. And it makes sense, right? Because people then get deceived, they get lied about. They don't know what they're getting into. Transnationality is also different. Smuggling is transnational by definition. To smuggle something, you need a border. If there is no border, it doesn't make sense to smuggle. Trafficking, instead, doesn't need a border. We see that a lot of the human trafficking that happens within countries. And a lot of the victims of human trafficking in the UK are UK nationals. So clearly people who have not moved to a different country. And then finally, the source of profit is another big difference, because for smugglers, the main source of profit is the money paid to be smuggled. That's it. You pay money, you get smuggled. That's the money that you're making. For traffickers, it's the exploitation that is the main source of profit. So traffickers As I said, some traffickers may smuggle you through borders, yes, but the main money they make is by exploiting you after you cross the border. If you even cross the border, because then, as I said, a lot of the people, a sizable part of victims of trafficking are, trafficked in the same country. So regarding recruitment, here we have, I'm going to use some of the data that is provided by the United Nations, and especially by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, that you see mentioned here. We see that most of the recruitment happens by taking advantage of vulnerabilities. So we see here basically court case summaries from several countries in the world, basically showing what are the factors that traffickers have taken advantage of to basically do the human trafficking, to basically recruit people into being trafficked. And we see here that by far the most common is economic need. So economic need, in 51% of the cases, it was economic need the traffickers took advantage of to get people to be trafficked and exploited. Then we have 20% like a child with a dysfunctional family. So of course, the absence of a functional family may lead children to leave or to trust people from outside who may be traffickers in this case. The intimate partner as trafficker, 30% is very interesting. Some traffickers, especially the ones who act individually and that act to basically carry out sexual exploitation, they use deception. We'll see in the next slide that the deception is one of the most important means of recruitment. And basically, they pose as an intimate partner. They will court a person. Normally, it's a man courting a woman, although not necessarily. And basically, showering her with attention. This may seem silly, but it is like a very psychological, manipulative process by which these people pose as people that can be trusted. And then when they got the full trust of the victim, then they start asking for more and more exploitative things. So this is actually pretty important to understand how people get trafficked for sexual purposes, for example. And then we got several other issues like mental illness, immigration status. So the fact that you are in a country legally makes you vulnerable to exploitation, being deprived of parental care, limited education, limited knowledge of foreign language, and physical disability. So we see that it could be an economic vulnerability, family vulnerability, a legal vulnerability, or a case of manipulation by another person. And we see here, basically, the UN has collected all these different cases of people being victims of traffickers. And now they have found the means used by traffickers for the recruitment. So not the vulnerability, but the means. And we see here that most cases see deception, and then abuse of vulnerability, and then a mix of the two as the main means of recruitment. Violence is used only, explicitly at least, only in 4% of the cases. Now, of course, maybe the sample is biased, but that shows that deception and abuse of vulnerability are the main ways in which people are being recruited for trafficking and end up being exploited. So it's about, consenting, trusting people that end up being, just traffickers and, generally exploiters. We see here the different sectors that exploitation, happens in. So we see that by far the two most common ways of exploitation for at the endpoint of trafficking is either forced labor or sexual exploitation. So these are by far the two most common. Then you can see that there are mixed forms of exploitation. So some people may be exploited for both reasons. Think about a woman working as a maid, being forced to work as a maid and also be subjected to sexual assault. And then the interesting one, the fourth one from below, is trafficking for forced criminal activity. And this is interesting in the case of the UK because it's very common among children in the UK for the phenomenon of county lines. So county lines, of course, the children who are exploited to sell drugs in different cities from their own to avoid police activity. That's the definition of county lines, basically. That those children are victims of trafficking, and their exploitation is forced criminal activity. So we'll get into this a little bit later. And whenever it's about forced labor, it tends to be very practical, physical, displeasurable, so to speak, forced labor. So, stuff that people would not want to do, maybe in some cases. So domestic work, construction work, fishing, agriculture, stressful, things like catering, street trading, mining, garment. You see, all of these are very practical manual labor that can be really intense. And of course, you can imagine the people doing those jobs, as victims of trafficking will be exploited from a point of view on number of hours worked, for example. Now, the methods of keeping people into exploitation are in part similar. So you see here, for example, in this list, there's violence and the threat of violence. Of course, the physical violence and psychological violence of being manipulated and being forced into doing something. The first thing on the list is debt bondage. So the idea is that, especially for victims of smuggling, people who are smuggled as well as trafficked, in that case, people will may not be able to pay for the smuggling, and that creates debt that then is paid by being exploited. So sometimes the debt is just an excuse, it's just something the traffickers will make up to basically be able to keep a person under their influence. Isolation is also very important. It could be physical isolation, it could be social isolation. If you remember, the those people whose trafficker is their intimate partner, so to speak, their boyfriend or girlfriend, the manipulation goes on to affect this. And basically the partner, so to speak, partner, of course, also starts convincing the victim, that they cannot trust their friends, they cannot trust their family, they can only trust them, and so on. And so they're isolating the victim from basically other people who are very important and who could help. In the case, of course, of illegal migrants, but any kind of migrants, it could be the confiscation of travel documents. So, of course, if a person needs a passport to come in this country and to leave, if you take the passport away, they're isolated, they're blocked. It could be a reprisal against the victim's family, of course, especially for people who know the victim's family. And even in some cases, magical beliefs and practices that are used to take advantage of superstition to basically convince the person to do what the trafficker is ordering. Now, where does trafficking go? I said before, and I'll say now, most people are trafficked within the same country, and or at most within the larger region. So think in the case of the UK, that would be Western Europe. Some parts of the world show some very sizable trans-regional trafficking flows. And those cases tend to be limited to basically people arriving in Europe, North America, and East Asia, but just to a lesser degree. So if we see here, using again United Nations data, 65% of the detected victims in the cases that have been found by the UN, but in this case it's like to 65% of 36,000 detected victims, were victim of domestic trafficking. So trafficking that took place within the same country. So we can see that most people, most victims that we know of are being trafficked within the same exact country. So this is pretty important, of course, because it really tilts our perception of what trafficking is and how it works. Now, 12% of victims tend to be within the same sub-region, so let's say Western Europe. 8% tend to be within the same region, so within Europe at large, and 15% from other regions. But so we see that there are flows that go between different parts of the world, but then most trafficking victims are from inside. And we see that in the cases that the UN managed to basically analyze, of 100 you see here on the right part, the right side of the slide, the 57 cases on 120, so almost half of the cases that the UN was managed to classify, traffickers recruited and exploited the victims within the same geographical area or to very close locations. That means that they exploited the victim within, let's say, if it happened, we are based in Huddersfield, of course, that's West Yorkshire, the exploitation would have happened within Yorkshire. So we're talking about very local, kind of flow of exploitation. It's only like a minority of the cases where traffickers intended to move the victims across borders or across borders within a large country. So if you think about the US, that would be those 16 cases on 120, that would be the cases of someone trying to trying to traffic someone from from New York to California. That would be it. So, there are some large flows. It doesn't make sense to ignore them, but a lot of the flows that we see are very local. They're domestic, basically. It's very difficult to understand how many people have been trafficked, especially if you're studying criminology. You may have heard about the issue of the dark figure of crime. So the fact that, some crime is not reported, and so we don't know about it. And it makes sense. Like when we study crime, that's one of the major issues. Of course, someone who commits crime normally doesn't want to talk about it. But so it's very difficult to do that with human trafficking as well. But there are reports, not very frequent, about forced labor, and it's the International Labor Organization that does that. Knowing that forced labor is one of the most important endpoints for human trafficking because it's a form of exploitation, we can tell from the forced labor estimates how many people are being trafficked. Now, the estimates are from 2014. Unfortunately, the International Labor Organization hasn't disclosed any more recent numbers. We can expect these numbers to have increased in the meantime, but we see here that they estimated at the time that 40 million people in the world were subject to labor exploitation by private individuals, private firms. 4.5 million were subject to sexual exploitation in particular, and more than 2 million would be subject to exploitation by states. So we see here that these adds up to around 20 million people in the world. So this is a sizable issue that affects literally millions of people. We can imagine that, due to various issues like economic crisis, conflicts and so on, these numbers may have increased. But see here that sexual exploitation is 22% of the people. So we're talking about millions of people worldwide. Now, when we talk about profits, again, the International Labor Organization's report comes to help, basically saying that from those 20 million people being exploited worldwide, profits in every year are around $150 billion. So it's a sizable figure. Now, of course, these are estimates, so it's difficult to understand how precise they are, but please note that sexual exploitation makes for 99 billion of 150 billion. So 2/3 of the profits come from sexual exploitation victims. 2/3 of the profits come from 22% of forced labor victims, which tells you why sexual exploitation is so popular, because it's very, very profitable. So the link between human trafficking and modern slavery, I think by now, I hammer this point quite often. Basically, the forced labor is the endpoint of human trafficking, and modern slavery is basically slavery is forced labor, and modern slavery is forced labor that is not legal. Of course, most countries, if not every country, has banned slavery long ago, but conditions akin to slavery can continue even in countries that have banned slavery, because of course criminals will want to hide these kind of exploitation. So the link between human trafficking and modern slavery is that modern slavery is the endpoint of human trafficking. It's also the thing that makes it profitable. Now, in the UK, modern slavery is said to be, according to the Modern Slavery Act 2015, is a term that includes any form of human trafficking, slavery, servitude, or forced labor. This makes things a little bit more confusing, but actually it makes sense because it includes, of course, slavery in anything but name, maybe, servitude, forced labor, and then human trafficking because it's part of the whole process. So this is the term that the UK is using in its legal kind of framework. Now, according to the National Crime Agency, which is the agency that takes care of all forms of serious and organized crime, and human trafficking is a form of serious and organized crime, coerced criminality is the most common form of exploitation in the UK. We'll see that these figures have changed a little bit, But you may remember coerced criminality being the third most common form of exploitation worldwide. In the UK, it was back then the most common. And UK nationals back at that time were the most frequent victims. So you see the importance of domestic trafficking. So the SCA estimated at that time, a couple of years ago, between 6 and 8,000 offenders are involved in exploitation of people in the UK. So you can understand now the size of the amount of people, and these are the offenders. And of course, if you add the victims, of course, that easily gets into the tens of thousands of people who are involved as offenders or victims in the modern slavery business, so to speak. The COVID-19 pandemic made sexual exploitation less profitable, but because crime is opportunistic and criminals try to find ways to basically take advantage of opportunities to make illegal money, that exploitation was displaced from sexual exploitation to labor exploitation. So people were exploited basically in sectors that were in high demand back then, like food supply chains. You can imagine about transporting food around, supermarkets, or warehousing. Now that we've gone back to normal for some time, it's very likely that things have reverted to what they were before. So the sexual exploitation has become profitable again. Now, the latest figures that we have available are for the first quarter of 2023. So, from January to March. These are figures available on the Home Office website. Basically, these figures show that first, number of people being referred for modern slavery increased again. So increased by 26% compared to the same quarter last year, which is sizable. And this is the highest number of people being referred for modern slavery since 2009. So clearly this is a problem that has been increasing, or maybe reporting has become more frequent, more easy, but still, it's a sizable problem. 27% of referrals were Albanian nationals, and 25% were UK nationals. So you see here, there is a sizable portion of victims that are from the UK, so entirely domestic trafficking. But then the most common nationality by little is Albanian. 77% of referrals are male, so you see that men can be most commonly the victims of human trafficking and modern slavery. And 51% of people claim exploitation in the UK only. So even if you are a foreign national, that doesn't mean that you have been smuggled, that you have been trafficked from abroad. So we see here that the majority, by little, but the majority has been exploited in the UK only. And we see here also another interesting thing: different forms of exploitation depending on age. For adults, labor exploitation was the most common. For children, criminal exploitation is the most common by far. And that's the impact of county lines. That's the impact of children being exploited to transport and sell drugs and do other things. Now, this leads us to, the main points that I want you to take home, really, so to speak. Human trafficking concerns all regions of the world. It's mostly domestic or at least intra-regional. So it's local to the country or to the region. It is based on deception. Of course, violence, force, and the threat of it can be pretty important. But it's deception and abuse of trust and power that, are key to enable human trafficking. Sexual exploitation is the most prominent activity globally, not in the UK apparently, but where of course it's prominent, but it's also the most profitable. And human trafficking is a fundamental enabler of modern slavery. Now, this is it for me. I want to open these up maybe for questions, if you have any in the chat. In the meantime, I will stop the recording.